Every day, the world moves on as it always has. Cities wake up, work begins, and life feels familiar. But beneath that sense of normality, something is shifting. The climate is changing, and the systems we rely on, energy, food, water, cities, finance, are under pressure in ways we're only beginning to understand. These changes don't live in reports or projections, they are already shaping people, livelihoods, and communities. We created the Climate Leadership Podcast so these challenges don't remain abstract or distant, but are explored through the people working inside these systems, making real decisions with real consequences, often without clear answers. This is not a space for fear, blame, or perfection. It's a space for honest conversations about what leadership looks like in a changing world. If you're listening, you're already part of that leadership. Let's begin the conversation.
Welcome to another episode of the Climate Leadership Podcast, where we explore the ideas, policies, and innovations shaping our climate future. Today's question is simple but very important. Do carbon markets and climate policies actually work? Around the world, governments are using tools like carbon pricing and regulations to reduce carbon emissions. Many of these efforts are guided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and global agreements like the Paris Agreement. But there is still a gap between ambition and results. To help us understand this, I am joined today by Dr. Steffen Kallbekken. He is research professor and group leader for climate economics at CICERO in Oslo and a lead author of the IPCC. His work focuses on climate policy, behavior economics, and public support for climate action. In this episode, we will explore what is working, what is not working, and what needs to change. Thank you, Dr. Steffen, for giving us your time today.
Thank you for having me join you.
So before we start our conversation, may I request you to please share a bit about your climate journey so far?
Yes, it's certainly, I think a journey is a good word for it. It's always been shifting. As a student, I started with environmental science, so more on the natural science side, studying things like hydrology, soil science, pollution science, etc. In my master's, I moved on to environmental economics and environmental management. So that's where I started on economics, but also things like how to set up protected areas, reserves, etc. So more on the management side. And only with my PhD did I fully go into economics, focusing on behavioral and experimental economics. So that was a journey from the natural sciences into economics. And then in my work at CICERO, where I've been for 24 years, I started out as a research assistant programming the first general equilibrium model that we had. With my PhD, I started doing experimental economics, so mostly lab-based experiments. And over time, that's transitioned into more of a mix and probably today more survey-based experiments than lab or field experiments. So it certainly has been a journey, but one thing that's been the same the whole time has been, I think I was 15 years old when I decided I wanted to work on environmental issues. And once I did that, it's always been on the policy side and specifically mitigation policy. I haven't worked much with adaptation, so it's been on mitigation policy. And the last at least 15 years, mostly focused on policy instruments, so carbon pricing, regulations, information, etc.
Right. Okay, so let's get started. Across many countries, carbon markets and pricing mechanisms have become central tools for reducing emissions. They are often presented as efficient and market-driven solutions. Based on the evidence you have seen, how effective are these instruments in reducing emissions in practice?
Well, they are efficient and maybe moderately effective. So just go a little bit deeper. So meta-analysis reviews show that the sort of typical impact of a carbon pricing scheme, a tax or an emissions trading scheme is cut emissions by some percentage points, maybe between 5 and 20% is a typical impact. So that's sizable. It's not 100%, which is where we need to get by the middle of this century, but it's quite sizable. And it's typically better at incentivizing companies and people to use off-the-shelf technologies. So if electric cars solar, wind power, etc., is available at reasonable prices, people will start using that with carbon pricing. It's not equally good at leading to innovation. For that, you probably need more targeted policies. So I would say it is efficient. It's quite effective. And if I had to pick just one policy instrument, it would be carbon pricing, but it's never going to get us to anywhere near net zero emissions without being supported by a wide range of other policies.
Okay. So, Dr. Steffen, can you give us a brief introduction or a short description of what do we mean by carbon markets and pricing mechanism? What does that mean?
Yes. So the general idea is that we try to incentivize people and companies to purchase, or not just purchase, to have less carbon intensive behaviors. So both, for instance, do you buy a fossil fuel car or an electric car? Once you have it, how much do you use it? So we're trying to get the price signals right. Two main ways of doing that. So one is a straightforward carbon tax, so much like we're all familiar with fuel taxes, for instance. You just sort of add it to the cost of the product based on the carbon content. And the other is emissions trading schemes, where there are different versions, but the typical one is that you set a cap. You say emissions are going to be 20% lower in 5 years than they are today. You set up legal obligations so that all companies have to have a number of permits matching their emissions, and then the market settles the price. So the stricter the cap, the higher the price. And the big flagship here is the European Union emissions trading scheme, which has been operational for over 20 years now.
Okay. Dr. Steffen, like, are these pricing mechanisms at the price level is enough for companies to stop emitting? That's, I think, the problem kind of a thing, right?
Yes, that's a core problem. So it varies enormously. What's needed, depending on which assessment you use, is some several hundred pounds or euros per ton. Most carbon pricing schemes are at a far lower level. Typically, the intention is that you start low and increase over time. I guess it has turned out a bit more difficult than expected to increase efficiently over time. So where you do have carbon pricing, the most typical design problem, I would say, is that the price, so either the emissions trading price or the tax rates, is just too low to trigger meaningful or large emissions reductions. So that's absolutely the key design issues with carbon pricing.
Okay, I see. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brings together global research and provides a strong evidence base for climate action. At the same time, there's often a gap between policy recommendation and real world outcomes. From your experience, are we overestimating how effective current climate policies are?
Well, yes and no. I don't think once a policy is in place, we're overestimating by much how effective it will be. There are nuances, of course, but I think that's the general problem. I think the problem is more that we're overestimating the likelihood that the policies will be implemented. And there's quite a big gap between governmental ambitions, so the overall targets they set, typically some level of percentage reductions over time, and the policies actually in place. So I would say the gap isn't that we incorrectly estimate the effect of a policy once in place, is that we expect or assume policies to be in place and they're not, or when you do introduce them, there are a lot of exemptions, or as we already talked about, the tax rates are too low, for instance. So it's in the implementation phase that you really have these challenges.
Right. Okay. So carbon markets have been implemented across different regions with mixed results. Some have delivered progress while others have faced criticism. From a broader perspective, what explain these differences in outcomes?
Well, first of all, when we say carbon markets, I'd say the distinction between tax and emissions trading is quite critical. Taxes are much more visible to the consumers, that they increase the cost of fuel, heating your home, etc., flying quite directly. So they're faced with a lot more direct opposition. Emissions trading has more hidden costs for consumers. They're still real, but they're more hidden. So it's the companies in power production, for instance, that pay these additional carbon costs. Of course, they're forwarded to the consumers through the prices, but it's less visible. There's been fewer negative responses to them. So first of all, there's a difference there in how visible they are to consumers. And again, it comes down to these design issues. So the price we talked about, but the exemptions, for instance, for emissions trading schemes, there are typically some kind of size or capacity limits on who's included and who's not. It doesn't make sense for every little kiosk on the street corner to be involved in emissions trading. You want somewhat larger units for it to be efficient. So you have all these rules that together make up the overall efficiency of the scheme, and those vary widely across countries. And I think from a political economy point of view, you typically set up pricing where you have the least resistance, and that's often where it's the least effective. So it's acceptable because it's not going to change much. Yes, you'll pay a higher price, but people keep on doing the same as before. It's much more politically problematic where it would change things. So for instance, in agriculture and food, you see very few examples of pricing because it probably would shift behaviors, and people don't necessarily want that. So there are some patterns that you can observe across countries.
Right. Yes, I do understand that, policies are implemented or developed by politics, their political parties. So, like, what levers are governing what policies political party will implement? Like, are there core groups, scientists, people who are feeding information to the political parties for these policies?
Well, yes. Again, of course, this differs by countries, but most OECD countries, at least, have set up various sort of knowledge systems. Quite often, you have skilled civil servants who are trained in economics, political science, the law, etc. They rely on government commissions. I've been a part of several myself, providing guidance or suggestions to the government. But it often comes down to political questions in the end. So you might have all the sort of good academic research backing for the proposals, but then quite often at the end of the process, it's a political decision. Is it the right time? Is it the right instrument? Is it the right stringency? And that's where things change. So I was, for instance, part of the secretariat for the recent Norwegian Climate Commission for 2050. Came up with quite a broad range of, I would say, holistic policy suggestions. Government very much took on board the way of thinking and almost none of the specific policy proposals. It's quite a direct comparison. You can compare the white paper we produced with the sort of official government position that followed about a year later. So although there's quite a lot of knowledge, quite a few experts involved in these policy processes. In the end, it comes down to policy decisions, and these quite often differ from the academic recommendations.
Right. Okay. So countries are adopting a wide range of climate policies beyond just carbon markets. What general factors make climate policies effective across different national contexts?
Context is the key word. So it's about what change you're trying to achieve. So I mentioned already that carbon pricing is typically quite good at getting companies and people to adopt the technologies that are already available. In a lot of markets, you'd probably want to support that with some quite targeted research and development policies. But of course, it depends on where you are. I live in Norway. It wouldn't make sense for us to try to subsidize the car industry to produce more electric vehicles because we don't have a car industry. So yeah, that's what I mean by context. So I think a key idea is that you work on strengthening the enablers and building down the barriers to policy implementation. And that's quite often the role of these supporting policy instruments. So you might have informational barriers. So you provide some information about, okay, you introduced a carbon tax that targeted the power sector. It's increasing electricity prices. Then consumers might need some additional information on the options they have to reduce their energy use in their homes, weatherization, installing heat pumps, better insulation, different things you could do. You might need information. There might be some problems with the market. Maybe these decisions, if it's mostly a rental-based market, people don't own their homes, you need to target the landlords instead of the tenants, and that differs a lot by country. So it's these things that you said context, and that's absolutely the key word. So you need to design targeted policies that overcome the barriers to adopting more climate-friendly behaviors.
Right. Okay. So your research focuses on behavioral economics, which looks at how people respond to policies in real life, not just in theory. Often, even well-designed policies face resistance. Why do people resist climate policies such as carbon taxes? And what does this mean for policymakers?
Yes, so this has been increasingly well studied. When I wrote my first paper on this, 15 or more years ago, I think I found something like 6 relevant papers to cite. Last year, there were about 1,000 papers published on public support for climate policies. So it's been really been a massive growth and interest in this topic. And we have some big meta-analysis and reviews, so we know what really matters. So we know that two factors really tend to dominate people's sort of perceptions of and attitudes to policy instruments, and it's how they see the fairness and effectiveness of the instruments. So on fairness, this of course there are a lot of aspects to it. It's sort of both the outcomes, the process, who's involved in decision making, etc. But most often it's about distribution. So are low-income households disproportionately negatively impacted by the policies? That's a strong driver for opposition. So it could be that you agree this is good overall. I want to reduce emissions, but some vulnerable groups in society are hurt quite badly by these policies, and that's a reason for objecting to it. And that's, of course, very reasonable. But we do also see that there are quite large misperceptions. So people typically believe, especially taxes, to be far more regressive than they are. A fuel tax is usually not as regressive as most people think, for the simple reason that the poorest people don't own cars and don't drive them all that much. It's more the middle class that's hurt by fuel taxes typically. So factors like that. On effectiveness, people typically don't believe the policies to be very effective in changing behavior and reducing emissions. Of course, a little bit hard to say precisely what these misperceptions are, because it's difficult to ask people what do you think the price elasticity for this good is. It's not something familiar with, so it's a bit more indirect, a bit more qualitative, but there are quite strong indications that there are strong misperceptions there as well, that people do think policies are less effective than they actually are. So that's another factor, and you do see that providing information and effectiveness can increase support. And there are the other factors. So the big two are fairness and effectiveness, but also climate concern. It's got an obvious link. The more concerned people are, the more willing they are to support climate policies. Trust in government. Do you trust that if it's a tax, will they spend the money wisely? Will it be used for the purpose as intended, etc.? So trust is another key factor. And then there's a long list of others. It's worth noting that the socioeconomic variables are usually not very important. So age, gender, education, things like that are usually not major factors. Some tendency that younger people are more supportive, and women are quite often more supportive of climate policies than men, but they're usually not strong factors. It's more about people's perceptions of the policies.
Right. So, Dr. Steffen, I was just thinking, like, when you said about fairness, if we divide our economic strata as high, middle, and low, if it puts a lot of pressure on the low class of that segment, and they are more in the number, like 60%, 20%, 10% in a society. So they will have a more pushback to any policy if it is negatively impacting their economic, especially in today's day and age when there's inflation and salaries are not increasing.
Yes, it is very understandable. But I think there are good and bad designs in these situations. So in Norway, we've had 2 situations recently where the government has responded to price increases by giving consumer subsidies or price reductions. The first was the energy crisis of 21-22, when Norway introduced a price subsidy and later the option to have a fixed electricity price, a low and fixed price. And then this year, after the Strait of Hormuz crisis, where oil prices skyrocketed, the politicians decided to temporarily disband the fuel tax in Norway to keep prices lower. And what this does is that, yes, it does, of course, ensure that the people with the lowest income are protected. Lower income people spend more of their income on fuel and on heating their homes than the higher income people do. But of course, the higher income people also do, in absolute terms, spend more on fuel, on transport, etc., and heating homes. They have bigger homes. So it's quite a blunt tool. And in these situations, especially for electricity prices, I have some colleagues who have simulated how you could target this differently. So for instance, a flat rate subsidy based on your house size would be more targeted, and you would keep the incentive to still save energy, which you reduce a lot when you have these fixed price or subsidized price schemes. So there are ways of providing more targeted transfers that ensure that low-income households are not overall that negatively affected, but you still keep the incentives to reduce fuel use, to travel less, etc.
Okay. And before we move forward, I have one more question I was thinking. So, for example, you take China, which is an authoritarian regime where policies are introduced and there is no pushback. It's like government is doing for your benefit, so you'll do it. And then there comes democracy like US, India, Europe, where there's a lot of people participation. And policy implementation takes a lot of time than it may take in China. So what do you think regarding this?
Well, first of all, it's interesting to see that there's quite a lot of research on public support also in China and other countries where people do not vote. So to me, it's kind of linked to voting. Not that you very often vote directly on the policies, but you elect the politicians. So you think there's some connection there. But there's still quite a lot of interest in the topics. I think even though these regimes don't rely on direct public support, there's no voting, they're still concerned about legitimacy. So they think if they're doing things that are too unpopular, it could be a risk to their regime. So they're still somewhat sensitive to these things. And I've often heard the argument that it's a lot easier to adopt really stringent, radical climate policies in less democratic societies. And that might be true in principle, but in practice, the most ambitious policies are in democratic societies. Europe is on most counts the clear leader here, including the UK. So although in principle it might be easier in less democratic countries, the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that's where most of the stringent policies are in place.
Okay, understood. So many climate policies are technically sound, but they struggle to gain public acceptance or long-term support. This can limit their effectiveness. How important is public support in determining whether a climate policy succeeds or fails, and how can government build that support?
Yes. So this is something I've always been thinking about quite a lot. You have this really big literature now on public support, and there is clear evidence that public opinion relates to policy implementation. So of course, there's a few rare cases where you have direct referenda. You've had it in Switzerland, Congress in charge in Stockholm, some in Washington State in the US. You had some direct referenda. And then, of course, the implication is direct. You need majority support to implement the policy. But more typically, these are in representative democracies, so it's more indirect. And there isn't a one-to-one link. It's perfectly allowed and legitimate for politicians to implement policies that don't have majority support. So I've been quite clear on the point that public support isn't about finding what has majority support. First of all, you could have clear majority support from the public, and it still wouldn't be politically feasible because you have really strong interest groups that are lobbying against it, so the oil sector or the car manufacturers, etc. Or you could have that you have majority support among the people, but you have some really vocal minority groups, not as in, for instance, ethnic minorities, but more like they make up 5% of the population, but they're really interested in this issue and they take to the streets, write to the politicians, go on social media. So you have really vocal opposition. That could still be enough to shut down the policy initiative. So it's more about the intensity of these preferences. So majority isn't like a key factor here. It's more about the political pressure they place on politicians. Yellow Vest movement in France is a good example here. It wasn't a small minority, but it was the majority that was really strongly against these fuel tax increases, but they almost shut down the country and the reform was stopped. So you have some clear examples of where minorities, really vocal minorities, can shut down policies. What you can do about support, first of all, instrument choice matters. Taxes are unfortunately among the least popular options. Substance information, other policies are more popular, but of course you're also considering effectiveness, and their taxes do perform well. So things like earmarking the tax revenues help you implement the tax and gain public support. So studies consistently show that earmarking the revenues mostly for environmental purposes, but also for returning it to households in different ways, lump sum transfers or different ways of doing that, do increase support quite substantially. So we do know quite a lot about the design, and then there's communication. So information on the effectiveness, on the purpose, on the distribution impact, etc. of policies can help build that public support.
Okay, sure. So we often see governments introduce strong climate policies, but over time these policies are weakened, delayed, or even reversed due to political or economic pressure. Why does this happen? And how can policymakers make climate policies more durable?
So first of all, I think climate policy comes in waves. There was a strong wave around 2007-9. The IPCC, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded, etc. There's a strong wave around 2015 to 19 or 20 maybe. You have the Paris Agreement. You have the Fridays for Future strikes, etc. was really high on the agenda. Then COVID happened and it dropped again on the agenda. So one thing that does seem to happen is that during these periods of really high interest in climate policy, governments set much more ambitious goals. They start implementing more stringent policies. And then a few years later, so reality hits, it's high inflation, other issues are on the agenda, and these issues are just less supported. And maybe also you might have had a change in government, so there are different politicians making the choices. So I think that's why you see some rollbacks. Not so often the case that policies are sort of entirely abandoned, but more that you either reduce the tax rates or you don't follow the planned tax rate increases that were there, for instance. So you do see this sort of weakening or you add more exemptions. So this sort of more weakening or not following up a planned tightening of policies, you do see that over time. And I think it's about, of course, elections, different parties in power, and also about the sort of changing saliency of the climate issue.
So, like, when Trump came into power, that was like a total U-turn from the Inflation Reduction Act which Biden brought in, and then Trump came into power with "Drill Baby Drill" slogan. So these are like two poles apart, right?
Yes. So and that was a clear policy reversal, and he has completely abandoned some policies, not all, some abandoned, some weakened, etc. You've had the similar situations in Australia, for instance, with the sort of CO2 tax debate going back and forth quite strongly. Canada, which introduced this, not a federal carbon tax, but a mandate that all provinces needed to have a tax of some form or some design options. That was retracted, not sure, 2-3 years ago, something like that. So we've had some clear examples of policy reversals, mostly driven by different parties being in power or different politicians being in power.
Right. So different countries are taking different approaches to climate policy depending on the economic structure and political priorities. Are there any countries or regions that you believe are getting the balance right today?
It's difficult to say today because this is a long-term project. So I think you raised an important question previously, sort of, can we maintain these policies over time? I do think the EU is doing quite well, to some extent, although recently there have been some more policy reversals and weakenings in the UK than you've typically seen. But this is the region of the world where you have quite consistent emission reductions over time. You've had strong policies in place that haven't been weakened too much. So I've been concerned at times that the European Union policies might be weakened because of the so-called greenlash, that other policy issues dominate, climate change is lower on the agenda, people are concerned about security, war, inflation. But so far, they've mostly maintained their policies. So to me, sort of that's a sort of empirical proof that if it's cutting emissions and it's not being abandoned over time, to me, that's proof it is working. Probably I'm not familiar with all countries of the world, but Europe does seem to be a leader on the mitigation side, especially on climate change.
Right. So looking at past experiences, there have been both success and failures in climate policy implementation. These offer valuable lessons for the future. What is one common mistake that policymakers continue to make?
Well, I think there's two things. So one is making changes that are too sudden. I think that was the case with the fuel tax in France that triggered the yellow vest movement. So sort of too rapidly introducing policies that are too stringent. So I think the important thing to do is that you prepare the ground. So for instance, if you want a higher fuel tax, make sure there's decent public transport, that people can switch to electric cars. So you might need to invest in charging infrastructure, for instance. So you need to prepare the ground. So instead of making sudden changes that force people to change their everyday lives overnight, prepare the ground, sort of do the infrastructure investments, the support schemes that you need in place, and then you can ramp up policies. That's one thing. The other, I think, main mistake countries have made, and my own country, Norway, is a clear example of this, is that whenever climate policy is high on the agenda, you set really ambitious goals, and then you don't have the policy instruments to meet those goals. So it's politically, of course, that's quite a convenient way of doing things. So you always just increase the goal and you look more ambitious. But I'd like to see a much stronger focus on the policies and measures in place and less on just the overall goal. The debate tends to be so often just about, okay, are we cutting 50% or 55%? Well, it doesn't matter much if you're not going to meet that target. So I'd like to see a bigger focus on the instruments you're using to get there rather than on the headline goal.
Right. Okay. So finally, as we look ahead to meeting global climate targets under the framework like the Paris Agreement, there is increasing pressure to accelerate action. If you had the opportunity to rethink climate policy at a high level, what would you do different?
No, I would use all the insights we now have from this public support literature to design. I would still put carbon pricing at the core, even though we know how unpopular it can be. I would put it at the core, but we have all these lessons on what can make it more acceptable. So especially, what I call preparing the ground. So invest in public transport, in cycling and walking lanes, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, things like that. Prepare the ground, introduce gradually, and you learn. One thing we've seen is that people tend to increase their support with experience. So once you've been exposed to the policies, you observe that they were not as bad as expected. Maybe I've been quite transport focused because it's easy to think of specific examples here. So with the one thing we know from the congestion charge in Stockholm is that when people observe that, okay, there was less congestion, less noise, fewer accidents, and maybe you found it easier to adapt than you expected because you found out there was a bus route you didn't know about, or it was more convenient to cycle than you had anticipated. They do change their perceptions and become more supportive. So a bit more political willingness to take risk, or just guts, more political guts to implement policies that seem unpopular, but just trust that over time this looks different. That's something I think would be useful. But especially this, avoid these sudden shifts. This is a long-term journey. So build support, build the infrastructure, and then you ramp up ambition over time.
Right. That's very true, Dr. Steffen. Like people like even me, we have a lot of preconceived notions that a change will be too difficult, but once we do it for ourselves and we find it valuable, then we adopt it very quickly. So I think that's a very good way forward.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Steffen, for sharing your insights today. This conversation shows that climate policies and carbon markets can work, but only if they're well designed, strongly implemented, and supported by people. The key takeaway is clear. Climate action is not just about policy, it is about behavior and trust. Thank you for joining us on the Climate Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network. See you next time. Until then, take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.